Okay, so there's a line of inquiry, philosophical inquiry, going all the way back to the days of Hume. By far the most influential philosopher in the atheist community as of this day. But there's a line of philosophy going all the way back to him that had its logical flowering in logical positivism. Logical positivism can be summarized by this axiom. The only meaningful statements are those that can be empirically verified for. Now, the obvious rejoinder is, can you empirically verify for that statement? No, it cannot. Okay, so it's like the liar's paradox applied to philosophy. So if your philosophy is correct, in other words, your philosophy is wrong. Correct. All right, moving right along. The only problem, even the guy who came up with logical positivism, Ayres, I think is how you pronounce his name, not sure how you pronounce it. I watched an interview with him the other night. It's really, really, really very interesting. He goes, the main problem of logical positivism, and he just chuckles as he said it, was that it was false. Oh, yeah, okay, that's a pretty big problem. But the biggest problem of logical positivism is that it was so profoundly influential heading into the 20th century. It is still, the ghost of it is still with us today. Scientism was its stepchild, still really influential today. And the things that, logical positivism, if you know anything about the history, there is a guy, Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, not Kant, who is actually where the term positivist gets traced back to. Now, so influential is this line of thinking on today's atheist community that you would be hard-pressed to find that if I told you some of the things that these people say, you'd go, wait, that sounds like the atheist. Yeah, it sounds exactly like the atheist. Comte has a schema, a sociological schema. Could easily show up in an Aaron Ra video next week. Why? Because it's exactly what Aaron Ra thinks. It goes, basically there are three progressions in human society. The first one would be religion, which he calls, I think, the fictitious level, where very primitive, you go, how did lightning, you see a bolt of lightning, go, oh, must be Thor, that's why that happened. Then the second progression of humanity as a whole, its sociological schema, is metaphysical. Metaphysical, this would include a religion like Christianity, where there's principles that ground, principles that transcend and ground reality. So it's a little bit more sophisticated than just your primitive religious thinking. And then the third and final flowering of humanity would be the positivism, where we only ascertain truth knowledge by that which is empirically verifiable and objective and empirically verifiable for. Basically the same thing that a lot of atheists say today. Same thing a lot of atheists say today. Do you have evidence for your sky ferret? You try to present an argument. An argument isn't evidence. Why not? Because it isn't empirical evidence. The only thing they usually mean is, can it be empirically and verified for? And that's, the same way, by observation and experiment. That's positivism according to Comte, C-O-M-T-E. The only things that have real truth and meaning are things that can be objectively, empirically verified for, based on observation and experimentation. That could easily be coming out of the mouth of an atheist today. Easily. Exact same paradigm of reality. And it is very similar to logical positivism. It's heavily influenced on logical positivism. The irony is that they didn't study philosophy at all. It's just a natural conclusion. And Ayres, I believe it was Ayres who said logical positivism at his peak said, we did it. We killed philosophy. Philosophy's over. Still, that idea is still with us today. Go talk to an atheist on YouTube. Say something about philosophy. Oh, philosophy, that's an archaic way of thinking. Say something about metaphysics. We don't do that anymore. We have science. Even some of the comments on my videos. I started saying materialism is insufficient to explain the data. I guess I won't mention his name because I don't want him to be the constant butt of my joke. But he goes, materialism doesn't account for things. That would be science. Huh? That's an absolutely cuckoo land, incoherent idea. Yes, materialism counts for things. That's the whole point of a philosophy. Has to be consistent in three key areas. Is it parsimonious? Does it have explanatory power? And is it logically coherent? Some people have a couple others that they add. I think Christian idealism adds two other categories. It's basically the same idea, though. Now, the reason why Hume is so influential is because he hitched his star to empiricism. So going back to, I've already touched on this in other videos, you had a Hume's fork. Empiricism is very important. Why? Because it was heavily tethered to the idea of the physical sciences, which proved Hume hitched his star to the right horse. Let's put it that way. Why? Because the physical sciences from the days of Hume have enormous explanatory power, and that is heavily rooted in the mistaken notion of materialism. Why do the physical science have enormous explanatory power? Because everything easily reduces, almost everything easily reduces to just its physical properties. And it led to this false assumption that materialism it led to for mistaking the woods for the trees, so to speak. Now that we see how successful this is, it is because of materialism that it is so successful, even though materialism turns out, as I think I've evidenced in other videos, but I'll go into again in this video, just for everyone's edification, that materialism is false. Why? Because almost everything easily reduces to just physical properties. Two glaring exceptions are the exceptions that decimate the rule. The hard problem of consciousness, which says phenomenal consciousness is in principle irreducible to strictly physical properties, and the even more vexing measurement problem in physics, which absolutely case closed is irreducible to just strictly physical properties, which I will explain one more time in this video for the edification of all listening. But the reason why Hume was so astonishingly successful had almost nothing to do with him. It's because he hitched his star to empiricism. And people associate his version of skepticism with empiricism, which ultimately Hume said, we don't do metaphysics. Hume said that. We're done with it. Why? It's speculation. This idea going all the way back to him that metaphysics isn't about anything. It's meaningless. It had its logical flowering in logical positivism. And the flaw of logical positivism, even according to the guy who invented it, is that it's false. Is that it's false. Why? It's basically the liar's paradox as philosophy, as I just said. The only meaningful statements are those which can be empirically verified for. Hey, interesting question. Can you empirically verify for that statement? No, I cannot. So, in other words, if your philosophy is true, your philosophy is false. Yeah, pretty much. All right, moving right along. That's why it came and went. But in the meantime, it was really, really influential. Why? Because it was part of a logical conclusion of a certain line of thought that had been heavily influencing the material sciences from all the way back to the days of Hume. And people have misappropriating the success of the physical sciences to materialism. So much so that they think that the physicalism/materialism and science are synonyms. As I've said 1,000 times, even Sean Carroll literally says, yes, I'm a physicalist. Why? Because I'm a scientist. He thinks it's synonymous. And the other thing I've been saying the whole time is your metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world are the entirety of the ballgame. Why? Because you can't see past those. If that's your starting point, it's literally almost impossible to see past it. And Sean Carroll, as I've compared to Rebecca, the young earth creationist, same idea. Both of them have a metaphysical a priori assumption about how the world operates. In his case, physicalism/materialism. In her case, young earth creationism. And it's really, really hard to dissuade them otherwise. Why? Because it's hard to see past it. You automatically filter all of your information through that false paradigm. Rebecca, I apologize for using you, but you're a good example. Rebecca's a great channel, by the way. She's really nice. She's a really nice person. She's really sweet. She's, like I said, she's doing really well with the harmless as a lamb. Stephanie's getting there. Rebecca's there. Rebecca's pretty much there. Stephanie, you're getting there. Okay, they're great. I understand that. I already said that. You're no longer. They still think you're Attila the Hun. You know, you're just gonna have it's gonna take you about 5 more years to live that down. You know, well, whatever. It's not a fair charge, Craig. Well, you did have that one controversial tweet one time 4 years ago. Can't ever forget about that one. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that one. So, ergo, she's Attila the Hun. But, getting back to the subject at hand. So, it's literally almost impossible to see past your metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world. Why? Because they color everything you see. The other example I've used time and time again, Pine Creek Doug. His starting point when you enter into conversation about the religion, the supernatural does not occur. Can you imagine what compilation of material facts it would take to shatter that paradigm? Tons. Can't even imagine what would happen. The only thing that can possibly move that needle is for him to have a religious experience or see a miracle with his own eyes. Other than that, firmly resolved before entering the conversation with you, It's why he won't ask you any real questions. He just tries to move to debunk you. Why? He already knows you're wrong, remember? Why? Because the supernatural doesn't occur, Craig. You get it? He's only asking me questions to lead me to his already foregone conclusion, rooted in his metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world. So, what's a budding young apologist to do? Young apologist. Yeah, I'm a young apologist. I've only been an apologist for four or 5 years. 4 years or something like that. No, not exactly young technically. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. Getting up there, as I said, I don't wish to discuss it. Well, what the apologist is to do, and this is why I started moving into precepts, is get at the precepts. It's going to be relatively easy to do. Why? Because this ground has already been thoroughly covered philosophically by Kant and potentially a lot more importantly, Gödel. There was a crisis precipitated in mathematics. Let's go to Gödel's incompleteness theorem for just a second. Gödel's incompleteness theorem has profound metaphysical implications. Really obvious ones and profound ones. Just a word before I start. So heading into the 20th century, the scientific community adopted almost to a man, almost en masse, the philosophy that we are done with philosophy and the metaphysics that we don't do metaphysics anymore. Why? That speculative gobbledygook woo stuff. We don't do that. You even go to a bookstore today, apparently. I didn't notice this, but I assume that people are telling the truth. And the metaphysics section is like, crystal healing and all this weird, occult stuff. That's what people think metaphysics is. Woo. Rather than just assignations of what things in fact are. So, heading into the 20th century and heavily influencing every atheist today listening to my videos, except for the rare few who I always cite, the people who are more philosophical, and the thought leaders, people like Robert Wright, who's technically an agnostic, and Bernardo Kastrup and Philip Goff, they're all philosophers and they all do metaphysics. Donald Hoffman, John Vervaeke, the people who I always cite are technically atheist agnostics, Carlo Rovelli, but they all do metaphysics and they're all philosophers. Why? Metaphysics and philosophy is coming back into vogue. Why? By necessity. By necessity. It's literally impossible to do science without philosophy. It's impossible to interpret without an interpretive framework, and that's all philosophy means necessarily. That's all philosophy means at its root, an interpretive framework. So when I said interpretations of quantum mechanics are philosophy, that is the tool of the philosopher being applied to science. Ditto for the idea of parsimony. Are these data points parsimonious? That is the tool of philosophy being applied to science. There is no such thing as science is so advanced and far-reaching and so powerful that it's done with philosophy and it's done with metaphysics. That's an incoherent thought process born out of logical positivism, taking the skepticism of Hume and following it through to its actually logical and rational conclusion. I'm not saying those guys were dumb. I'm saying they're taking their forefathers and they're working on their ideas and pushing them to their logical conclusion. If objectively verifying for things an empirical investigation, and that's done by observation and experiment, if that's really powerful and that gave us so much truth deduction mechanisms, maybe that's the only thing we need. Those are the only things we can be positive about. That's the root of the word positivism and the association. So what has this got to do with Gödel? Because a crisis was precipitated in mathematics, okay? And as I was starting to say before I went back just to make sure I had the ground covered, Gödel's incompleteness theorem has profound metaphysical implications. It is basically a proven fact. It's almost considered standard issue in the mathematical community, and it annihilated a certain type of philosophy of math called the formalist. Why? Because what it proves conclusively, no ifs, ands, or buts, that if you are relying on the formal logic of the system itself, you could literally prove a lie. So mathematics has to be grounded in something transcendent to the system itself. The key word that I'm going to use a lot, transcendent. Why? It covers a lot of the territory we're talking about. Ultimately, the only thing we are trying to prove to the non-believer, the skeptic, is the transcendent other than the natural world. It's going to be relatively easy to prove. Why? Because it's necessary precondition of intelligibility, just like the presuppers say. Just like that's what the presuppers say. Yeah, they're correct about that. Necessary precondition of intelligibility. All your sense-making apparati are located, or a huge chunk of them, in the transcendent realm. But we aren't there yet, kids. Slow down. Slow down, Stephanie. I'm hungry. I'm hungry to kick some ass, Craig. I'm all fired up now. I think I'm starting to get it. You're definitely starting to get it. But we got a ways to go before I turn it into a coherent argument for the Sky Fairy. So everyone just relax and enjoy the ride. And if you're an atheist, get ready to give me those ties. Could be a month from now, could be 5 months from now. I don't care. I want those freaking ties, atheists. Get ready to give me the ties. And if you deconverted, the ties go all the way back to the day of deconversion. Yeah, there's back ties. You owe me. You owe me back. That's how it works. You don't like it? Too bad. That's the system. That's the system in this church. You owe me tithes all the way back from the day of deconversion to today. And I want those tithes. Atheist tithes are the best type of tithes. Beautiful, 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 lovely tithes. So, where was I? Okay. Gödel's incompleteness theorem. If you are relying on the logic of the formal system itself, of the intrinsic to the system, you could literally prove a lie. I explained this in other videos, but I'll go over this one more time. In Hume's fork, you had two branches. Matters of fact, which isn't in dispute, and relation of ideas, of which he would put mathematical axioms in. In relation of ideas, true by definition, was how they were trying to define a mathematical truth. Okay? But that's relying on the formal logic of the system itself. The problem is you could literally use it to prove a lie. So I brought up the example of the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox, I say to you, this statement is false. You're lying, Craig. I'm lying. Why? Because the statement is true. So the statement is true that the statement is false. I'll explain that one. Exactly. Exactly. I gotcha. It's a lie. It's the truth. It's a lie. It's the truth. My head's going to fall off. Your head will fall off if you think about it too much. It's basically a who's on first for the intelligentsia. But when applied to set theory and the formal logic of mathematics, you could apply it to set theory and it precipitated a crisis in mathematics. The crisis being brought out by the idea prior to Bertrand Russell's, discovery, keyword discovery, that you could apply the logic of the liar's paradox to set theory in mathematics. Prior to that, people were trying to ground mathematics on formalism, formal logic of the system itself. So it precipitated a crisis. Why? Because you could literally prove a lie. Literally. If you're relying on only this intrinsic logic of the system, you could literally make the system say 2 + 2 = 5 and have it fit within the formal logic of the system itself. So the mathematical axiom obviously and entirely has to be grounded on something transcendent to the system itself. That's Gödel's incompleteness in a nutshell, theorem in a nutshell, and he literally proved it. So he's basically done away with the whole idea of a mathematical formalist. There used to be them, now there really aren't. It's like young earth creationism. Apologize for bringing that up, Rebecca, but it's over. It's like young earth creationism. It's not something that people actually hold to. Why? Because Gödel's incompleteness theorem annihilated as a category. But what it's saying and what the metaphysical implications are is something transcendent to the system itself is necessary in order to ground the system. So if you are starting out as a mathematician and you want to use the formal system, your starting point are a series of assumptions and a series of set of axioms that you start with in order to use the system. Now that has profound metaphysical implications. The same metaphysical implications that can be applied to the ongoing crisis that people say is happening in physics as of this day. With the onset of the quantum era, a lot of people say this, physicists, people who are into philosophy of science, that physics is still undergoing a crisis to this day. Why? Because they haven't figured out how to make any coherent sense of quantum mechanics. If you listen to my channel, you know I think that there is a resolution coming in the way of Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics. The reason I personally think why that has been so slow to catch on and so slow to adopt, even though it's really obviously parsimonious and as far as I'm concerned, really obviously correct, or at least mostly correct, is because it annihilates materialism as a candidate option. The thing that the smart scientist was looking to uphold when he began the investigation. This is why metaphysical a priori assumptions are so powerful and important. Why? Because when you start with them as your starting point, you can generally only see things through their lens. Think of how much of a supernatural occurrence would have to happen to Pine Creek Doug for him to ever switch his presupposition that the supernatural does not occur. Really think what it would take. It's not that resolute in every atheist. With him, it's really resolute. He's even told you ludicrous things you'd have to he's even said, he brags about this like this is a slam dunk for his side. Unless you're Elijah from the Bible and you can turn water into fire, I'm never going to believe a miracle. Okay, that's the exact opposite of sensible. Sensible dictates, and furthermore, it's irrelevant to Pine Creek. Whether Pine Creek acknowledges or not is irrelevant. The reason why this is going to be so much easier than people think is twofold. Well, maybe threefold. Before I get way ahead of the curve, way ahead of myself, let me just finish the thought that I was in. How you prove that naturalism is false is you just prove a miracle. Doesn't have to be the most groundbreaking, outlandish miracle that ever walked the face of the earth. Doesn't have to be hallelujah to the Lamb of God. He proved the resurrection. You shouldn't start with these really big deal miracles. Why? Because those are a heavier lift, and especially if there's a lot of emotional significance attached to it, like it's the centerpiece miracle of Christianity, for example, resurrection. Getting an atheist to acknowledge the reality of that particular miracle is a really heavy lift. Why is it not that heavy a lift for a Christian? Because they have metaphysical a priori assumptions and starting points that make that a lot easier to believe in. One of which I already pointed out is almost every single solitary Christian, bar none, even the most wussified of the wussy Christian, believes that God is to some degree awesomely powerful. Awesomely powerful, you wouldn't pray otherwise. When you start praying, you think that God could actually literally move heaven on earth on your behalf. And even the most wussified Christian thinks that. So when they get into a situation where a kid gets hit by a car and is in the hospital, God forbid, guess what they do? They get on their face and pray. The Christian who didn't have that much faith prior to that still sort of prays in that situation as if God could do something. And still kind of sort of believes that God could do something. Otherwise, you wouldn't pray at all. And everybody prays. Every Christian prays all the freaking time, which means we automatically presuppose, and it's a really rational inference, guys. If there is a God, every statement that you've ever thought theologically, if you put an if qualifier in, you can actually make it a lot more coherent and a lot easier to validate and prove to yourself. If there is a God, that being would be awesomely powerful beyond all human understanding. That's a no-brainer, correct? You understand what I mean? There's no arguing with that. I didn't say there is a God. I said if there is a God. Therefore, it logically and automatically follows that being could do the undoable, the impossible, the technically impossible. So that's not too much of a stretch to think of a resurrection. The reason why you shouldn't start with that with an atheist is that there's a lot of emotional baggage involved on their end, whereas you might be able to demonstrate a miracle to them that's smaller, more down to earth, and more local to get them to shift their metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world that the supernatural does not occur. Do you understand now why that would be a wiser course of action? You weaken their resolve in that metaphysical a priori assumption about the world. You weaken that. The only way to get them to see is to weaken that. So you deal with smaller, easier, the logic of unless, and the atheists try to jujitsu the whole system so that they make it literally unprovable to them. I need to see a leg grow back. Okay, that doesn't decimate naturalism. No, you don't. All you need is a tiny little small miracle to show you that naturalism is insufficient. That's it. Once a small miracle occurs here, guess what? Naturalism's over. Why? Because the supernatural occurs. Period. End of discussion. For you to set the bar ludicrously high is ludicrous and it's unnecessary. Why? I don't care if I prove it to Pine Creek Doug. Who cares what he believes, ultimately? That's his agenda. I care what the person in front of me believes. I don't care at all. This is why we got to get at the building blocks of the belief system altogether. Show what actually is entailed with the building blocks of the belief system altogether. Because that's where the ultimately generates the belief from. And most people don't even know what their underlying metaphysical a priori assumptions are about the world. They don't even know. Because they haven't even looked, they haven't thought about it. Ask yourself, ask an atheist, are you a mathematical fictionalist, logicalist, Platonist, or novelist? What? Trick question. I have no idea, Craig. I understand that. What do you think of philosophy of mind? You know, some people who deal with this stuff all the time and make videos, some atheists think about this stuff all the time. Why? Because they're philosophical in nature. So they're always thinking about stuff like this. Like Emerson Green, Danny, who I had on my channel. The smart atheists always think about this stuff. That's what they do. That's why they're here. Because they're thinkers. But most of these Dumbo clowns on Twitter, they have no idea what they're talking about. No idea what they're talking about in any of them, including with science. They're Mr. and Mrs. Science this, science that, science is so awesome, science, science, science. Ask them to explain quantum mechanics for 5 minutes if they don't know anything about science. Anything at all. They don't know anything about science, I promise. I've seen them try to talk about this stuff when I'm not there. I mean, they don't, I'm there, just I see them, but they don't know I'm there. Like, wow, this is just, if you got your information about philosophy of mind, quantum mechanics, anything at all, basically, from other atheist videos, check your sources. Why? Because there's a really good chance that you are trafficking in disinformation and have no idea that you're doing it. Why? Because most of that stuff is absolutely ridiculous. Most of the atheists who set those trends only go far enough to write off this or that. So they have a catchphrase. Oh, easy, emergent property in the brain. Okay, that doesn't tell us anything about the hard problem of consciousness. It's irrelevant. Oh, it's easy, Craig. So they just engage with it enough so they can dismiss it as a challenge to atheism. That's it. That's most of what they do. That's not true of every atheist. I'm just saying that's a huge chunk of what goes on in atheist land with content creator videos. They don't know anything about these topics. Anything at all. I told it to Paul Gia. He took offense to it. I'll say it again, Paul Gia. They're really incurious about a whole bunch of stuff, including religion. Really, really, really astonishingly and pathetically incurious about religion almost entirely. Ask any of them to name anything about religion, you know, other than what Frank Turek said about Christianity. They don't know anything. Anything. And Paul G, I guess he asked who are the heavy hitters. The heavy hitters in apologetics, Paul, are Kant and Plato, for example, and Gödel. Those are pretty heavy hitters, Craig. I understand that. No, they're not the local apologist who's got a following. Nobody cares about that guy. You know, unless it's IP and he's grounded. The only reason why we care about IP is that he's smart enough to be grounded in some of this stuff philosophically. He's educated himself enough to have actual depth. That's the only reason we care about IP. And anybody who shows up on Capturing Christianity, who I say, yeah, that guy's worth watching, the only reason we care about them at all is what they've studied enough of this in depth to be worth hearing from. Other than that, no, nobody cares about some mid-level apologist, including you, the atheist, should not care. This logic like, well, they're the popular ones, who cares? Do you go about debunking, like, you know, the popular Sex in the City? Are you debunking that? That's a really popular show. Or at least it used to be when my wife was in. Do you go about debunking that? No, why? Because it's not up to the level of even engaging with. Hello? Hello? You're being called out correctly and you guys are not heeding the call. Oh, we can stay with like the mid-level hanging fruit. No, you can't. You're going to be vaporized pretty soon if you don't get it together and start climbing up the food chain. Why? Because we're gonna, you won't see it coming. That's why. I don't know. You don't believe me. It's the truth. I apologize for that rant. I don't know where that came from. Sort of just came out of left field. But that's, you know, I said it to Paul G, I think 2 years ago. So one thing I know, that's why I always tag him in my videos. Well, I'm not sure if he watches. I don't think he does. But I always tag him just in case. I can't tell. Because I say a lot of nice stuff about Paul G in the video. He never seems to notice that either. So, but I said something about atheists in general. They're really incurious. I meant the content creator videos. They don't know anything about anything. They don't study these topics past like just making a dopey video to debunk, like, who cares? Some mid-level apologist that maybe a good apologist. I'm not dissing Frank Turek. I have no idea if he's good or bad. I just notice him because they're always getting upset about something he said on Twitter. That should tell you everything you need to know. Why? Because they only grab at the things that they can easily debunk or easily make a point. Most of them are team players, and all they care about is grabbing at the low-level fruit that they can score some fake points about. Oh, big deal, no one cares. Who are the heavy hitters? Plato, for example. I think Bernardo Kastrup, some people might laugh at me saying that, but I honestly think that Bernardo Kastrup is getting somewhere really important. Plato, for example. I would put John Vervaeke in the level of that too. I might be overrating both those guys, but they're new and interesting to me. I'd put Donald Hoffman in that category too. Might be overrating him. Carlo Rovelli, that's not necessarily theist. None of those guys are necessarily theists. But they're on a trend Did I explain? Well, gosh, I'm all over the place in this video. Did I even explain what I was talking about with the metaphysics? Hold on. Simmer down. Simmer down. Getting there, getting there. 29 minutes. Okay, not terrible. I'll rant and rave for 5 more minutes and then I'll call it a night. The metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world are the starting points. The how we get this and how we prove the sky fair is going to be relatively easy. Why? You get at the building blocks. The building blocks that presage the belief. There is no such thing as a belief discontexted from a metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world. That's the starting point. And when you have your starting points lined up correctly, there are certain things that logically and automatically follow. The reason why the transcendental deduction is such a powerful tool of inference, and it is a powerful tool of inference that is being dramatically underutilized by the Christian community, is that there's a flaw in traditional apologetics. The thing that we are ostensibly trying to evidence for, supernatural, meaning by definition outside the purview of empirical investigation. The reason why I've been bringing up logical positivism and Hume and Kant is that this ground has already been laid by people smarter than us and better than us. They've already tried to devalue everything in the transcendent realm. The only thing that they can't get rid of completely was math. But everything else they put under the category of this is suspect. Why? Because we can't empirically verify for it. If it doesn't have spatial, temporal locality, if it isn't concrete reality. Most of the atheist starting points from back of the last 100 years, if it isn't matter in motion, it isn't really there. Why? Because we don't want to hear about it. Why? It's speculation. And what it precipitated, one, a crisis in mathematics that was solved by Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which tells you have to presuppose the mathematical axiom, you have to ground the logic of the system in something transcendent to the system. That is powerfully important. And it is related to the transcendental deduction. Why? Because the transcendental deduction is a way of getting at the given. Given the given, what needs to have occurred in order for the given to be the case? It is a way of using philosophical argumentation to get at and prove the transcendent. Get at and ultimately prove the transcendent. Not going to be all that challenging or hard to do. Why? Kant has already covered this ground. Like I said, if Kant were easier to understand, everyone would know that. Kant's really hard to understand, so nobody knows that. The transcendental categories was his way. The only difference between Kant and theism, where we can't use them, is I'm pretty sure that Kant considered these internal psychological mechanisms, as somebody objected to when I said the laws of logic. Said if Matt Dillahunty already agreed that the laws of logic exist, they're inviolate, transcendent, immaterial, he is already in principle agreeing to something in between theism and atheism, whether he acknowledges it or not. The trick is to get him to acknowledge it. Then somebody had the one objection that holds water, okay, tool of inference. That's all the law of logic is, a psychological inner tool of inference. That's a great objection, potentially valid. That's why I said 2 transcendental categories. Ultimately, there's going to be a few that I pick. But 2, math and logic. Because math, you can't successfully argue that as a tool of inference, and that alone. There are 3 positions in math, 2 of which grounded in a reality extant to the human being. So as I said, you've got 3 positions, 3 possible interpretations of what math is. Nominalist, Platonist, fictionalist. Fictionalist is incoherent. You've got 2 now to choose from, both of which ascribe some reality to the transcendent realm. Math is the bridge that proves the transcendent realm. So you've got basically all of your atheists all agree, matter, motion. And then you've got on the other side all your happy theists. Hi, theist here. Hi, Jesus, love you so much. Happy, happy theist in transcendent realm. All comfortable here with feelings and all these feelings and no facts. And I love faith so much. Jesus, I feel you in my heart. I love it so much. But we have a bridge, and that is math. And you cannot do away with math. Why? Because they already tried once and precipitated crisis in mathematics. And it was proven, literally proven, that you need to ground the mathematical axiom in something transcendent to it. Now we're engaged in a new crisis because in physics, and that crisis will be resolved in a way very, very favorable to the theist, as I've already tried to argue and say. There's not that much we need to do except to unpack everything successfully and get the atheists to see that we're telling the God's honest truth. That's it. Then collect the tithes. So, step number 1, unpack Kant, unpack Gödel successfully. Step number 2, get the atheist to see the logic of what you're saying about. Step 3, collect those beautiful ties. Collect those ties, buy the jet, fly off to Never Never Land. Win. Win it all. Okay, maybe I said it too quickly, but that's the roadmap. I didn't say I successfully accomplished it in this particular video. Pay closer attention, please. Thank you very much. 35 minutes. I guess I'll wrap it up. I don't want to make these videos 50 minutes long anymore. But that's going to be the roadmap ultimately. Will I be successful? Almost positive I will be. Why? Because I don't see it being all that challenging. The atheist tells you they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. What the atheist doesn't seem to know is that they all say, in principle, the exact same thing. There's an invisible, immaterial, transcendent realm that undergirds and interacts with the known visible material world. Bang, gotcha, all. That's what they all said. The only thing me and the other types of theists are arguing about over is what form does that take? Form, interesting word, going back to Plato's forms. They tried to already cover this ground philosophically. Forms, transcendent, abstract objects, mathematics, unity of personhood. There's always been these metaphysics, these transcendent realm things that the hard-headed realist, rationalist type, matter and motion is all there is, if I can't empirically, objectively verify for it, it isn't there type, has already tried to do away with, and it didn't work. That's my point. It didn't work. Why? Because they are the preconditions of intelligibility. The sense-making apparatus is located in the transcendent realm. Just like the dumb old presupper set. They don't say it correctly and they don't handle it right, but they're basically on the right track. They started digging out with Kant, the ground that Kant has already covered. The only reason you don't know that is Kant is impossible to understand. It's impossible to understand. You got to understand his schema. And in order to understand his complex schema, you kind of have to have taken a class in him. It's really hard to pick up on the fly. Unlike Hume, who's easy to pick up on the fly. So was that? I think that was all clear. Actually, I think that made a lot of sense. You ask me. I think it was a really darn good video. You ask me. I think you're really getting your money's worth. Honestly, I really think everything I just said, even though I spoke fast and I said it quickly, I think it was all cogent. I think it all made complete and utter sense. And if it didn't, too bad. I'll unpack it in another video to come. I'm on the right track, and I know exactly what I mean. If I'm not speaking clear enough for everybody to understand where I'm going and why, I apologize. I'll get there. Basically, I think it's just unpacking a lot of the trends in modern thought and how we arrived at this destination. Remember, atheism is still a relatively rare occurrence in the world. It is a relatively rare position. That's really important. That's a really important detail that gets overlooked. So everybody seems to think that they have evidence for the sky fairy except the atheists. The atheist says, where's the evidence? Okay, it can't be empirically verified for, we've already discussed that. Why? Supernatural, outside the realm of purview of empirical investigation. But it can be transcendentally deduced. Pretty obviously so, and when I get that argument up to speed, I will pretty much guarantee you I can. Why? Because the transcendental deduction is a powerful tool of inference. Just as powerful as a straightforward logical deduction. Powerful tool of inference being dramatically, given the given, what needs to be the case prior to the investigation in order to have occurred. Almost everything you get about metaphysical a priori assumptions you have put in yourself by virtue of a transcendental deduction. It's why you have metaphysical a priori. It's why you saw something happen and you said, given the given, you said to yourself without knowing you're doing it, given that given, what needs to be the case in order for that to have occurred? So when the atheist was deconstructing, the church elder was telling some mumbo jumbo about the earth being 6,000 years old. Said, okay, the earth probably ain't no 6,000 years old. Given the given, so that's the data point. The church elder seems to be mistaken. So I've already said this in other videos, I won't go into it. So the first thing they do is they talk to the church elder. Big mistake. Why? Because the church elder wasn't going to give you anything other than a song and a dance. If he knew what was true, he would have told you what was true. If he didn't think he was right, he wouldn't have been saying it. Go to church elders. Oh, gee, they don't seem to know that the earth isn't 6,000 years old. Gee, I wonder why. The young earth gracious. Duh. Oh, I didn't know that. I swear to God, that's usually the first place. So let me ask the people in the church. Duh. I wonder what they know. They don't know any better, dude. You got to go outside the church. And you go outside the church, and you start finding out that some of the things they're teaching you are ostensibly probably not so. You get it? And that leads to a whole line of inquiry. wherein you doesn't need to lead to atheism. The reason why it does is you meet other atheists and you pal around with them. And they start talking about science this and science that, and fallacy this and fallacy that. And you start going, that makes a lot of sense to me. Atheism isn't belief. I believe that. Atheism isn't a worldview either. I believe that one too. And we're not a community, by the way. You and me hanging out, what? We're not a community. Okay, I get it. And then you go and preach. Now you're saved. I'm saved. Now let me go evangelize. You got any evidence, Craig? I just got evangelized in atheism. You got any evidence, Craig? I swear to God, that's almost exactly how it works. You start questioning your church correctly, probably. I mean, I'm assuming you're at a dumb church and tell you falsehoods. Other than that, no, you're a troublemaker. Other than that, you're just a troublemaker. No, you start questioning your church correctly. Okay, well, don't think there's no 6,000-year-old there, preacher man. Sorry to burst your bubble, but I suspect you're mistaken. So then you start first trying to verify the information with your family and your church elders, and they don't know any better, or they would have told you, right? So they don't really know what time it is. Then you start checking it around town. And you probably have varying degrees of welcome with open arms, or who cares, And you meet a group that welcomes you with open arms, the other atheists. And you go, hey, wait a minute, they're just like me. They're just like me, y'all. And then you plant their foregone conclusion about how the world operates in your brain without even thinking about it. While you flip metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world. You put on their lens, their social imaginary. You do it without even thinking about it. That's why interacting with people is where flipping a priors comes from. You pal around with the Democrats too much and you like them, guess what? You're going to become a Democrat. Why? Because their way of the world is going to start making a lot more sense to you automatically. You pal around with the conservatives too much, you start to like them and identify with them, guess what? You're going to become a conservative. Why? Because their way, the same reason. The key is, and why I think this is going to be so astonishingly easy, is the ground has already been traversed long before we got here. I'm pretty sure atheism is on the wane in terms of growing, that it's the Four Horsemen, for example, I know for a fact those guys are on the wane. Their influence is waning. Okay, there are other types of spiritual agnostic types, philosophical atheist types, who are agnostics and atheists. They're on the rise, but they're more like me than they are like Aaron Ra. The people I always mention, John Vervaeke is technically agnostic and atheist. Robert Wright and Carlo Rovelli, Bernardo Castro, they're all technically agnostics and atheists, but they're a lot more spiritual. They're a lot more like me. They have very similar metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world. When I hear Robert Wright and Bernardo Castro talk, I go, wow, these guys, they're pretty much theists of a different sort. So I don't think this is going to be all that challenging. Why? Because the only thing that happened to them is they started to actually just, educating themselves. Bigger picture than just YouTube atheists. Listen to YouTube atheists, you're in the echo chamber. Get out of the echo chamber. Get out of the echo chamber. Why? Because they don't know what time it is at all. They're giving you disinformation about important subjects, for the most part. I promise. Most of them don't know jack squat about jack squat. There's exceptions to that, but the exceptions I always point out. And most of the exceptions would listen to every minute of this video and go, yeah, most of this is correct. Alex Malpass exception, the philosophical atheist I always reference. Those guys again, yeah, those guys again. Those guys again, yeah, those guys again. And, there's a couple omni-atheists that float around who are smart and know what time it is. But a lot of those guys are like Philip Goff. He's technically an atheist. But he's a lot more like me than he's like Aaron Ra. A lot more. In reality, yeah, he is. We'd get along. We'd agree on almost everything. Him and Aaron Ra wouldn't see eye to eye on anything. So get out of the atheist thing. Get out of the atheist echo chamber and start learning. Grow up a little. Go watch start with the freaking, Joe and Luke crew. Those guys put out 2 videos every week. Most of them are good. Those are the only atheist videos I watch anymore. They're good, usually. They go over, topics of relevance to the atheist community, and they handle it pretty well. They use actual critical thinking. So go watch them if you're an atheist and you want to know where to go. Those guys got your number. Those guys. That's your solid info, because they don't disinform you. They're not just trying to score fake points. So they don't tell you like Christian, religion has been so responsible for all the violence in the centuries. Hitler was a Christian. They don't tell you garbage just to score fake points. They try and get at what's actually true. Hitler was a Christian. Did you know that? It said God mittens on the belt buckles. Oh yeah. Then it was a Christian army. Yeah. How's that work? I'll go into that video. It's hilarious. Holy Kool-Aid. I watched that. Did anybody watch that? Tim O'Neill sits down with Holy Kool-Aid. Like I said, Holy Kool-Aid is trying to bring more to the table. I respect him for that. Respect Holy Kool-Aid for having it on your channel. That's a perfect example of an atheist who is more ally than opponent. Why? Because he's trying to get at what's true. It's not just trying to, hey, let me endorse this stupid belief. Why? Because it scores some fake points for atheism. Gotcha, Christian. No, you didn't. Why? Because the point's not true. The point is invalid. Oh, I didn't think about that. Yeah, exactly. If it's not true, or if it's irrelevant, like God mittens on a belt buckle of the Wehrmacht, that's pretty irrelevant. No, it's really important. No, it's really irrelevant. I mean, it was funny. I've listened to the video. I gotta wrap this up. I know. See, this is the part I always start having fun at the end. I gotta start having fun sooner in the video. This is why I stayed at the bar till 3 in the mornings too. Why? Because I always start to get energized and start chatting and have a couple more drinks, Craig. Yeah, let's stay up talking all night. Once I don't know, something snaps inside of me, and then I just talk. And I can go on for 5, 6, 7 hours. So what was I talking about? Okay. I'll do a video on it, I guess, the Tim O'Neill stream with Holy Kool-Aid. It's good. The problem is that it needed to be done at all because it's embarrassing. It should be embarrassing to the atheist community that some of this stuff is so rudimentary and so obvious and so basic. The fact that it needs to be said at all if you're an atheist, it should bring shame upon your entire community. It's not a community. You don't want it to be. Why? Because shame on the entire community. Because it's pathetic. Some of this stuff is so obvious. It's the standard stuff that I used to, when I first got here 4 years ago, there used to be a lot of atheists. They did seem to have disappeared, but there used to be a lot of people saying Hitler's a Christian and, the Wehrmacht was a Christian army because evidenced by the fact that it said God mittens on the belt buckle. Okay, that's not an important detail, dude. So he went into all of that. It's fun. I might cover it. But I shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to have watched it. You shouldn't have to have made that video. But they did. So there you go. All right, I'll wrap it up. I'll stop talking. All right, fair enough. Stop talking, Greg. All right, I'll be quiet now. So there you go, kids. I really think it's going to be no more complicated than unpacking a whole bunch of, because the philosophical trends that presupposed atheism basically had their logical flowering in logical positivism. That's as far as that line of thought goes. That's as far as that line of skeptical inquiry goes. And then there's other transcendent categories that need to ground things in order for X to be the case. X is a necessary precondition of Y therefore X. And that includes all the philosophical, metaphysical, a priori assumptions about the world. The physics are the facts. There's no debating that. There's going to be very little maneuvering room to correlate the facts with metaphysical a prioris. Why? Because the physics are so darn precise. There aren't 50 different interpretations of quantum mechanics, guys. There's roughly 10. Of those 10, roughly 5 are mainstream. Why? Because the physics don't allow for a whole bunch of, outlandish views of reality. They allow for roughly 5 different interpretations. So ultimately, all I think this is going to be about is unpacking. Unpacking, getting people to think clearly about the metaphysical a priori assumptions that they carry into the debate before they debate. You started out deconstructing as an atheist. My hat's off to you. Keep going. You haven't finished. That's it. So I'm saying you haven't finished. Keep going. You aren't finished. Keep going. That's it. That's it. That's it. And then if not, what if I don't, Craig? Then Stephanie's coming. Then be afraid. Why? Because Stephanie's going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. I'll go testament on your ass. You'll be sorry ever. Because that's what's coming. Because Stephanie's going to come and debate you. And the final analysis, kids, be afraid, be very afraid. Why? Because Stephanie is coming to debate you, and she don't look happy to see you. She only came here for Stephanie. How many reasons did you come here for? I only came here for 2 reasons, Craig. To chew gum and kick ass. And I'm almost out of gum. She's almost out of gum. You heard it, kids. Stephanie's almost out of gum. You better run, you better hide. Stephanie is coming to beat your hide. Stephanie's coming, kids. And she do not look happy to see you. That is all for now. The mass has ended. Go in peace. Amen.